Welcome to Threshold, a violent open-world action-adventure game set in near-future downtown New York. A new drug called mech has been sweeping around the city. However, the drug is fatally flawed and is very likely to kill those who take it over a specific limit. This is where the Mech Manufacturing Organization, or MMO, comes in. Mech is a specialized and crafted drug that kills its victims. However, the mech soon revitalizes them as soulless mechanized soldiers known as mechazoids. Enter the main character, Guy, a mech addict who has tipped over the fatality threshold and hasn't passed away. The mech starts altering his body, enhancing him to be less human and more mechanically efficient. The player can choose to continue taking mech to augment their body or fight their addiction to hold on to their remaining humanity. Threshold will bring the player through a story that will entertain them, while also provoking thought by testing their morality. To make sure our story resonates with the player, we are putting a lot of emphasis on impactful audio and visuals. This is a major reason why we're focusing on only 2 platforms for our release. We need both power and player accessibility to have a successful release, which leads us to a decision to put Threshold on both PC and PS4 platforms. This will let us reach the largest player base possible without spreading our resources too thin. And if we assume that some consumers carry both PC and PS4 platforms, we calculate a rough 70% coverage of consumers in just these 2 platforms. With the power of these platforms, we will bring our version of New York City to life. The city itself will look very similar to what it does today. Lights everywhere, lots of traffic, and worn down buildings. Because New York is the largest city in the United States, we want to make each area unique. The city will be split up into subsections on a map. New York itself is an architectural, urban jungle. Becoming a ghost in the crowd is not difficult due to the tightly packed streets and sidewalks. But as the city becomes a rundown train wreck of apartment buildings, high-rises, corner stores, and mom-and-pop shops, the player will be presented with options: disappear into a crowd, or use the buildings as escape routes. However, the city crowds won't only hide the player, but enemies as well. It will be difficult to distinguish regular citizens from members of MMO or their mechanized soldiers. The enemy types we will introduce in Threshold will vary greatly from one another. The mechanized enemies will walk more robotically and overall take more time to do individual tasks. Human enemies, on the other hand, will have more tools, tricks, and traps to use on the player. As the player progressively becomes more mechanized, their character will change to reflect it. This will also show in their facial movements becoming more stiff, as well as their body language becoming more weighted and heavy. As the mechanized player sprints or climbs buildings, they are less tactful and more forceful. This leads to surfaces beneath them crushing or crumbling under their advance. These heavy movements will not only look heavy, but they will also sound heavy. The player's choice to become mechanized will vastly alter how the player sounds. Guy, in a mechanized form, will sound a lot more robotic when moving and speaking. Becoming more mech will also raise the BPM, or tempo, of the music. Certain choices, like taking mech, will trigger audio cues such as a heartbeat for the human choice, or mechanical gears shifting when the player takes mech. In our story, Guy is a simple man who is drawn down the wrong path. He works hard to make ends meet, but turns to mech when his stress becomes too much to handle. After passing over the mech threshold and augmenting his body with robotic arms, Guy starts getting targeted by MMO. The evil organization tries to follow and capture him, but doesn't quite manage it. The player begins playing after a cutscene where Guy is running from a mechazoid on a motorcycle and ambushes him. This introduces the player quickly to the movement and combat aspects of Threshold. After this encounter, the player finds themselves roaming across the bustling city, and will come across the initial story mission to find Jackson, the supplier, in Guy's house. Jackson explains about MMO's leader, Carver Skinner, the true nature of mech, and his own role and agenda within the organization. Jackson's role in MMO is that of a recruiter, someone who gives people mech and builds their army of mechazoids. However, Jackson is very tactful in his targets, only choosing those he believes might be able to go over the threshold. After explaining to the player what mech can do to a person both positively and negatively, the player is given the choice to take another mech vial. Few missions later, the supplier is captured by MMO after losing his cover. The player is given another choice to take another vial of mech and storm the compound to save Jackson, or attempt to save him without the assistance of the drug. This choice is intended to be very morally heavy for the player. If the player doesn't take the mech, they will be unable to reach Jackson in time to save him. If the player does take the mech, they will save Jackson and lose some of their humanity in the process. This will show through dialogue and available player choices later on. From this point, Guy works, with or without Jackson, toward the goal of taking down MMO and stopping the spread of mech. Once Carver Skinner is taken care of, the player finds out that Jackson isn't exactly who he said he was. Jackson comes back, now showing that he has passed the threshold himself, and is trying to take control of the Mechazoid army for the armed forces. The player can choose to assist or fight the supplier at this point. Threshold will rely heavily on the player's choices and moral ambiguity. The player will have the choice between two distinct styles of play, or a mixture of both, to progress through the story. The player may choose to inject more mech into their system to become more mechanized, or to fight their addiction and remain human. This will vastly alter how the game is played, and in the same vein, change what endings are available to the player. For the mech playstyle, the player will unlock more abilities to enhance themselves physically. A mechanized player will gain more powerful abilities and resilience in combat. This will allow them to face enemies in hand-to-hand combat much more easily than a non-mechanized player. But mechanization will also cause the player to slowly lose their humanity. The more humane choices in dialogue trees will become unavailable. In addition, the mechanical parts can only take so much before they will break down. If this happens, the player will need to find resources to repair them, as opposed to human parts, which can simply be healed. Along with healing, human gameplay will change to become more stealthy and tactically oriented. The player must craft tools and use wit to defeat their adversaries. The human player will also be able to gather a following of allies to assist them both in and out of combat. These allies will gather info and resources for Guy, but in-combat assistance that allies will bring will vary from distractions to man-at-arms soldiers to supply drops. Players will need all the help they can get, since many enemies they meet will be far superior to them in speed and strength. MMO has a powerful influence, with both an organization of people and a robotic army to do their bidding, and will use both to try to stop Guy from becoming stronger. This leads to many differing enemy types. An example of this is that the player may become hunted by enemies during their adventure, and will be approached differently based off of their hunter. A mech hunter may decide to attack the player with brute force, breaking through whatever's in their path. A human hunter will be much harder to detect and set traps for the player. Thanks to the third-person perspective camera, the player will be able to actively scan for both hunts and traps to eventually avoid them. Movement of the character will play a heavy role in the character's feel while traversing the map. The player will have access to multiple events including information hunts to learn about MMO, mech removal, which is a brief combat sequence, police chases, and main story events. The player will be able to explore the world to collect upgrades for their equipment or themselves. Regardless of the player being mechanized or not, they will have access to a multitude of parkour abilities to help deal with these hunts or generally traverse the map. This will vary at base from sliding, jumping, vaulting, climbing, and wall running. These options will differ based on the player's state. A mech player will be able to use the body enhancements to run faster, jump higher, and perform other parkour moves more quickly and effectively. The human player will be able to craft tools or use vehicles to aid in moving quickly or with more stealth, such as climbing with a grappling hook or taking a taxi. All of these choices will tailor the game to bring each player an individualized experience, based entirely on their actions. Will Guy retain his humanity or embrace mech's enhancements to take down Carver Skinner? The player's choice between human or robot is not as simple as good and evil or light and dark. These tough choices will bring meaning to Threshold and carry a message to think about even hours after finishing the game. Will you sacrifice your own well-being to save more people? Will you find your own salvation if it means forsaking others? What does it really mean to be a human? Thank you.